All right, so today we're going to look at how the increasing sectionalism that we talked about previously, coupled with the increasing hostility over slavery, is going to lead to a complete breakdown between the two parties, increasing tension, and eventually the passage of the quote-unquote compromise Kansas-Nebraska Act, which blows everything up even further. And so as we can see in this picture, this political cartoon called Whig Harmony, these political forces are pulling the party in two different directions, and that's never good. So both parties are going to start to fracture during this time period in the 1850s, some faster than others. The main issue, of course, that's going to break everything down is going to be slavery, because the Whig Party and the Democratic Party before this time were primarily disagreeing about the role of the federal government and economic issues. And those divisions are still going to be accurate. Like, Whigs are still going to support the American system, and Democrats are still going to favor lower levels of government action. But now within the parties, you're going to see this clear divide between pro-slavery and anti-slavery and free soil forces. And so obviously that's going to lead to a complete political realignment. The second party system is going to totally blow up here, and we're going to see the beginnings of the third party system form today. So let's see how it all happens. The Whig Party is going to be the party that's going to blow up the most because, for hopefully obvious reasons. The Whig Party is most powerful in the North, and the strongest divides about slavery exist within sort of northern states. And so within the Whig Party, we're going to see a couple different factions emerge that are going to pull the party in different directions based on a couple things. One is the Wilmot Proviso, pushing for, obviously, the banning of slavery in newly acquired territories. And so what you're going to end up seeing is the Whig Party is going to break Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs. Southern Whigs, of course, being pro-economic, American system policy, but pro-slavery, and the Northern Whigs are going to divide even more complexly into the conscience Whigs, who oppose slavery, and the cotton Whigs, who are Northern but pro-slavery. And so we're going to have these three factions within the Whig Party that's going to quickly tear it apart and lead to its eventual downfall. The other thing that's going to tear the Whig Party apart is the Know-Nothings, which they're an anti-immigrant party that pulls also from the Whigs, because again, the Whigs are the working party of the North, or one of the factions of the Whigs is workers in the North, and a lot of them are going to become anti-immigrant, and so the Know-Nothings are going to also sort of siphon off Whig votes. And the fact that the Whigs, up to this point, don't have a particularly strong record. Zachary Taylor, as amazing as he was, wasn't the best president, and he was killed by ice cherries and lemonade. And before Zachary Taylor, all we had was William Henry Harrison, and his track record in his 30 days in office was less than stellar. Although he did give us probably one of the coolest campaigns in American history, as you hopefully remember. The Democratic Party is going to fracture among similar lines between free soil and anti-slavery Democrats, and of course the much more stronger pro-slavery fire eaters. And so, although compromise does tend to hold the Democratic Party together a little bit better than the Whig Party, and the Democratic Party is going to come out of this intact, Martin Van Buren and the Free Soilers are absolutely going to metaphorically set the Democratic Party barn on fire, quote unquote. But the guy who holds the Democrats together, or one of the guys who holds the Democrats together, is a young senator and congressman from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. Here's Stephen Douglas. He was known as the Little Giant, and he's going to become the preeminent sort of compromiser of the Democratic Party, which is going to sort of steer them through these rocks of potential political destruction. He was an extremely skilled politician, and here we see him charming a variety of different sort of snakes. And so an extremely smart guy and strong debater, he's able to find positions that allow him to sort of weave in between the different fault lines that are sort of tearing the parties apart in the 1850s. The main way he's able to do this is through popular sovereignty, which, as we believe we talked about previously, was the idea that whoever votes, all the voters in the territory are the ones who get to decide whether slavery is allowed there or not. And of course, as we talked about before, there are a variety of really deep potential problems with this. But for Stephen Douglas, this functions sort of like a shield for him, because he can use popular sovereignty to argue to people on both sides that he's on their side. So to a pro-slavery audience, the argument is pretty simple. Popular sovereignty allows you to move slavery into new areas. Whereas anti-slavery audiences, you argue, clearly, popular sovereignty is the way to keep slavery out. And so he's able to appear to be on both sides. And that allows the Democratic Party to sort of survive with this popular sovereignty shield, where they can sort of dodge the slavery question and not take a clear stance. This, of course, brings us to the election of 1852. As we hopefully remember, the term of Zachary Taylor wasn't the most effective, considering he was killed by ice cherries and lemonade, but Millard Fillmore was able to pick up the pieces and pass the Compromise of 1850, which was an attempt to sort of solve these issues, but in the end it just led to increased sectional fighting and increasing hostility between the political parties. And so what we end up getting here is a race between the Whig candidate, a guy named Winfield Scott. The Whigs do what they always do, and they basically go back to the well and pull up another popular general who wasn't super political. And as you may remember, Winfield Scott was the guy who led the assault on Mexico City itself in the Mexican-American War. So the Whigs choose an apolitical popular general, Winfield Scott, seen here riding a rooster because he's from South Carolina. And so, of course, again, Southerner, but not necessarily pro-slavery. So they've clearly got a type, the Whigs. And the Democrats really struggle to choose a candidate. They go through a variety of different candidates and end up settling on a guy named Franklin Pierce, who he's known as a dark horse candidate because he was pretty unknown before this, but he was from New Hampshire, and he didn't have strongly established positions on anything. And so whereas Winfield Scott is sort of tied down by all these different forces, the abolitionist forces, as we can see, the economic forces and nativist forces that are pulling his party in different directions, Pierce is able to sort of just be sort of a stand-in for the Democratic Party and not cause tons of controversy. And so of course, the Democratic Party, because they are a party that is more pro-slavery, they clearly have a significant power within the South. And so here we see Franklin Pierce, a Northerner, pledging his soul to the devil, while a slave owner looks on, and the spirit of Thomas Jefferson in the clouds, for some reason, is cursing their name, which, I mean, it's a powerful symbol, but I don't know how much the spirit of Thomas Jefferson would be cursing the Democratic Party for embracing slavery. So anyway, so Pierce versus Winfield Scott, and the end result is the Whig vote is just completely, the Whig vote is completely fractured, and Pierce wins in a landslide because the Whig Party was so sort of separated by all these different issues. And so Franklin Pierce becomes president, and honestly, he was never a particularly good political figure to begin with, and his presidency is going to be less than spectacular. But, as we saw in the previous electoral map, the fact that a dark horse candidate that no one was ever heard of is able to thwomp the Whig popular general strategy, the Whig Party is going to die its final death here after this election. And this is going to be the last election we really have a Whig running. And this happens for a couple different reasons. The first is that super old Henry Clay, who's super old by this point, dies, and you don't have sort of a strong central figure holding the party together. So Henry Clay dies, and the Whig Party is going to fracture sort of similarly to how the Federalist Party, without Alexander Hamilton, sort of spiraled off into obscurity and then eventual demise and destruction. Secondarily, the slavery issue was much more divisive for the Whigs than it was for the Democrats, because the Whigs were more powerful in the North and therefore had to deal with these stronger abolitionist and free soil wings of the party, and therefore they were, never able to really find that sort of popular sovereignty common ground between these different factions. And so Franklin Pierce of the Democratic Party becomes president. Here's your Franklin Pierce. He was known as Handsome Frank for what I hope are obvious reasons. I mean, look at those wavy locks. And his administration is generally considered to be relatively awful. He has some accomplishments to his name. He does buy the Gadsden Purchase, which completes the contiguous 48 states. Ironically, or maybe not ironically, but I mean, obviously, yeah. So the Gadsden Purchase ends up costing us as much as the entire Mexican cession, partially because we weren't currently occupying Mexico City, which gives us a weaker bargaining position, and partially because Mexico was somewhat bitter about that whole like Mexican-American War thing still. And so we buy the Gadsden Purchase. It's the little shaded part there, completes the contiguous 48, and allows for a transcontinental railroad path through the South, which of course we were spending a lot of time arguing about where the transcontinental railroad should go, and everyone was sort of drawing up plans for that. So the Pierce administration is able to negotiate the Gadsden Purchase, and then Franklin Pierce's son dies in a railroad accident, and he spends the rest of his presidency trying to drink himself into oblivion. And so he's going to basically disappear from our scene here, and the parties are going to, and Congress is going to do whatever, is basically just going to go ahead and do whatever they want, and there's going to be very little, we're not going to hear from Franklin Pierce again, really. So the other thing that we get under him, under Franklin Pierce, is the Perry Expedition. This is one of America's first forays abroad, and it's one of the cooler stories that hopefully you remember from world history. So I'm just going to give a brief overview here. And if you need more, I'm sure you can pull out your meticulously organized world history notes that you're still holding on to and go look that up. So the Perry Expedition was an expedition by an American naval officer named Matthew Perry to Japan. And these new steam-powered ships showed up in Japan with the goal of, basically opening up Japan to Western trade. Because, of course, since we had begun to settle the West Coast, we were now interested in cultivating trans-Pacific trade. And so we show up in Japan, and as you hopefully remember from world history, Japan had isolated itself from the rest of the world, or from a lot of the rest of the world, with the closed country policy and the acts of seclusion. And so Japan hadn't progressed much since the mid-1600s. So they're basically still a feudal, sort of samurai-based society. And so these American ships, painted black, they famously show up in Yokohama Harbor and then later Tokyo Harbor. And Matthew Perry basically threatens to blow these cities up if the Japanese don't open the cities up to trade. And so after a relatively impressive demonstration of these ships' firepower, by the way, I love the Japanese renditions of Matthew Perry and the ships. Here we see one of the black ships firing its terrifying cannon. Matthew Perry, depicted in a Japanese drawing here, forces his way in and basically opens up Japan. And so Japan is going to back off of their sort of centuries of isolation, open themselves up, and then eventually that's going to kick off the whole Meiji Restoration that, again, I'm sure you remember from your world history class. Interestingly enough, this is a tangent that I just love. Japan goes in this period of a sort of a crazy admiration for the United States. And so this is stuff that I found. This is a telling of the American story of American independence from a Japanese perspective. So in this panel, George Washington is being taught excellent archery by the goddess of America, which was absolutely essential in our gaining of independence. Ben Franklin, shown here in the middle, was so strong that he carried around a handheld cannon, which he used to defeat the British at Yorktown. And John Adams was such an excellent swordsman that he killed a giant snake that had, in order to avenge his mother in an awesome show of like filial piety. And so these are the founding heroes of America, shown through a lens of Japanese adoration. In the end, the end goal or the end result of the Perry expedition is the Treaty of Kanegawa, which is a treaty that gives the United States access to ports in Japan, opening it up to trade. So this is sort of our first foray into Pacific trade, and it's going to be really important in American history and, of course, Japanese history, because this is going to kick them on the path to modernization. So here's Commodore Perry showing up and going into the treaty house at Yokohama to sign the Treaty of Kanegawa. Here's a Japanese rendition of it. The other overseas adventure that we have during the Pierce presidency is what's known as the Ostend Manifesto and filibustering. So, well, anti-slavery advocates are pushing to ban slavery from moving into any new territories. Pro-slavery advocates are advocating to gain more territory in the Caribbean in order to potentially expand slavery further within those areas. The main area that we wanted to get was Cuba, because, you know, it's a massive sort of really fertile island relatively close to our coast. But the U.S. government didn't want to go to war with Spain over it yet, and so Cuba would remain out of our hands. But what we do get is all these sort of unofficial voyages to try to capture territory known as filibustering. And this is where an American would recruit a crew of adventurers and then sail down south to Latin America to try to seize some territory, hopefully declare independence, and then, you know, apply for annexation into the United States. You know, because this has been the pattern that's worked for us as far as, you know, acquiring territory to the south. So these expeditions, we had a number of them go into sort of northern Mexico, which all sort of failed. But the really big ones were trying to hit Honduras and Nicaragua during this time period. And the most successful of the filibusters is a guy named William Walker, who ended up actually overthrowing the government of Nicaragua and declaring a independent sort of country there, or not independent country, because of course Nicaragua was already independent, but declaring a pro-American republic and then trying to get the United States to annex them, you know, in the same way they did Texas. But unfortunately, one, the Pierce administration was not politically able to send troops down. And secondarily, you know, diseases and a variety of other things completely destroyed his army, and William Walker was eventually executed in Nicaragua. But this represents a clear departure, or a clear distance between sort of the positions of anti-slavery advocates, who were of course pushing that, like, under no circumstances should slavery be expanded, and pro-slavery advocates who are literally going down and trying to seize more territory to expand slavery into. So that brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because the territories of Kansas and Nebraska are ready to be organized, and the question of free or slave is somewhat up in the air. The problem for anti-slavery advocates is they got crushed in the election of 1852. And so pro-slavery forces, or at least slavery sympathetic forces, are dominant at this point. And so what we end up getting is this bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that organizes the territories and says that the Kansas and Nebraska territory will be open to slavery and popular sovereignty will eventually decide their fate. This is, of course, a huge victory for Southerners because the Missouri Compromise line clearly demonstrated that, or clearly shows that these territories should be closed to slavery, and they had been since 1820. And so, in a very real way, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened up territory to slavery that had been anti-slavery. And so the end result is massive outrage. Because, of course, you know, free soilers or anti-slavery forces could have slavery metaphorically forced down their throats by the Democratic Party. And we see here all of Franklin Pierce and Stephen Douglas and Lewis Cass, who you hopefully remember, and then James Buchanan, who we'll mention, you know, tomorrow, I think, pushing slavery down the throat of a Kansan. And so, and Stephen Douglas was crushed throughout the North by this. Abolitionists were furious that he had betrayed them and revoked the Missouri Compromise. And so he went on a sort of a campaign to try to convince people that this was a policy that we should endorse. And angry crowds met him in many northern cities. And so there was significant outrage. Here he is in Maine. You know, he in order to sell or to explain why he was going on this move, he said it was to visit his mother, and then, yeah, anyway. And so the end result of this is the reorganization of the anti-slavery factions into a new political party that's going to end up replacing the Whigs. This party is known as the Republican Party, and they are under the slogan of free soil, free labor, and free men. They're going to unite all of the anti-slavery forces, the free soil forces, the sort of Whig economic forces, and the abolitionist forces together into a new sort of like completely northern political party that's going to challenge the Democrats which are becoming increasingly contained within the South. And so this is the beginning of the third party system, as the Whigs are vanishing, and this new Republican Party, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about later, is beginning to coalesce. So slavery and the Kansas-Nebraska Act reorganized the parties, and we're moving finally into the third party system.